here. My name is Bertram McDonald, and I'm with the School of Information Management, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this lecture in the Information Management Public Lecture Series. We've had a very busy lecture series over the past academic year, and I believe this is now the concluding lecture for the term. There is another event that will be occurring later in the term on April 5th, which will be a research day in the School of Information Management. So watch for announcements about that, and if you wish to come back and learn about the diverse research activities that occurs in a field of information management, you can explore that on April 5th. I believe it's in the afternoon on that date. So today we're very pleased to welcome back to Halifax, maybe this is the sequel to the previous version of the novel, Dr. Proot to speak, and I'm going to ask Kate Newbook, a student in the Master of Library Information Studies program, to introduce Dr. Proot.
Dr. Proot obtained his PhD in Language and Literature at the University of Antwerp with a dissertation about Jesuit theatre in the southern Netherlands from 1575 to 1773. He recently became curator at Cultura Fons Library in Dilbeek, a private library near Brussels owned by the investment group Dijk. Dr. Proot holds teaching positions at Cask School of Arts in Ghent, where he teaches history and theory of graphic design at the Plantin Institute of Typography in Antwerp, where he teaches book history. In his current research, he is surveying book prices during the years 1555 to 1655, based on evidence found in the archives of Christophe Plantin and his successors at the museum Plantin Mauritius in Antwerp, in addition to French printed booksellers' catalogs. Dr. Proot is a recognized scholar on the layout and design of pre-1801 hand-press books. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Proot to speak about fonds of knowledge, transitions in the design of early modern print books in the Netherlands, a theory.
Thank you very much, Kate, for this introduction. Thank you very much, Bertram, for the invitation. And I would also like to thank the school here for having me back at 6 years ago now that I was here. And I enjoyed it very much. And I must say, it's a real treat to be back. And I don't know how he did that, but Bertram also makes sure that the weather is nice and cool and there's loads of snow. So thank you very much. So I'll just begin, and it's a sort of follow-up where I left off last time. So 6 years more of investigations into book design. 10 years ago, I embarked upon a long-term project, the aim of which was to discover how typographical design of hand-pressed books evolved over long time spans. The scholarly interest sprang from a double fascination. First of all, for a long time, I had wondered how typographical design in books worked and how one could tell, without knowing a date of publication, a 17th century from an 18th century book, or how one could see that a book with a Paris imprint, in fact, had been produced in Amsterdam, only by looking at its general typographical features. And second, in search for answers to those questions, it baffled me that this field of research was, for the major part, laying bare. Important case studies, such as the one by the Oxford scholar Richard A. Sayce about compositorial practices, here from 1979, it's actually a reprint, or the ambitious project by Henri-Jean Martin, published in 2000, about the mise en page and the mise en texte of the French book up to 1700, never really gathered following. While the former tried to decipher minute compositorial differences of books produced in Europe between 1530 and 1800 through a meticulous and fairly statistical analysis of 5 small composition features in some 1,000 books, the latter invited a group of scholars to produce more essayistic analyses of specific genres. And if we could define Sayce's case study as being systematic and coherent, but too small and too limited to be really useful, the French research is, on the other hand, much more hybrid. It deals with important books and genres, milestones, and we all know that kind of books with the 100 books from, and is difficult to put at work in other regions outside France. Inspired by both studies, though, it was my ambition to map typographical design features of books produced in the southern Netherlands, better to understand how it worked. I limited this project to hand-pressed books from this region, produced from the very beginning of printing with movable type in that region in 1473 until the beginning of the 19th century. Early on, it occurred to me that I should not focus on the exceptions, but use a large set of regular or common books, the boring books in fact, and include as many typographical features as possible. With a database consisting of hundreds of fields, well, it's scary, it almost holds 3,000 fields. Hundreds of fields, I hoped to capture at least those features which were supposedly relevant for this research. And so since 2009, this ever so hungry beast and smaller, more specific clones thereof were fed with data about thousands of books, derived from bibliographical sources, images of title pages, and of actual copies, inspected book in hand, and that's always the best, isn't it? For the early period, I tried to see as many editions as possible, often in multiple copies, and for later periods, I selected editions randomly in statistical relevant numbers. In the course of this process, I made adjustments where needed to the database and carried out a number of smaller studies focusing on specific periods, specific genres, specific typographical features, or individual cases which seemed promising to generate results. My first steps in this field date back to 2006, when I studied the evolution of printed theater programs of theater plays performed at Jesuit schools in the 17th and 18th centuries. This research was widened to letter families, so type families used to print text within editions and in which combinations they appeared on title pages in the southern Netherlands in the 16th and 17th centuries. And next, I focused on typographical features of title pages for Latin editions as opposed to vernacular editions, ranging from 1473 up to 1800. And in recent years, I studied the layout and design of incunables, so the books printed before 1501, and so-called post-incunables, books printed between 1501 and 1540, and discovered the evolution of paper thickness of early hand-pressed books during the first 2 centuries of book production in the southern Netherlands. In addition, I devoted myself to the study of individual typographical features, such as the use of flowers, fleurons, single vine leaves, like this one on the screen here, paragraph signs or pilcrows, and early tailpieces. The use of the epigraphic V for U. This is an important one. So you have the word juris on the here on the left hand side up there. Juris printed with a V. That's an epigraphic way of representing the U. And the phenomenon of typographical discontinuity. So here you have typographical discontinuity. So a hyphenated word, third line there, institutionum is hyphenated after insti, and then you have tutionum in a smaller typeface and in a different color. So that is typographical discontinuity. During the first and thus far most protracted phase of this research project, my understanding of typographical evolution was based on mainly statistic analyses of a fairly small region in the world, covering, however, about 3.5 centuries. But both the geographical focus and the longue durée proved to be very proved to be necessary for this kind of project, and you will understand why as I continue. Over to the results, and so I have to wrap up the results in 10 minutes of like 10 years of work, and I will not be able to illustrate every single point, but you will get a flavor of the most important things that are happening between the beginning of book production in Belgium and until the beginning of the 19th century. So fasten your seatbelts. It is of course impossible to give today a full account of all results, but let me use a broad brush to sketch the overall observations. Generally speaking, in the 1470s, the hand-pressed book was a luxury object, catered to upper strata of society, clergy, nobility, lawyers, doctors, and professors. The physical appearance and organization of the text is very similar to that of late medieval manuscripts. The most frequent book formats are the big ones, the folio and quarto. Smaller formats were rare. The ratio between text and white space on the page was about 40 to 60%, and the average size of type was fairly big. Often printers owned just a few fonts. Until 1500, black letter was the only type family used. During the first decades of book production in this region, books required the intervention of rubricators to add structure. Paragraph marks, lombards, and ornamental initials had to be painted in with red, blue, and yellow ink or paint. Thick paper was used for printing, which added to a look and feel similar to that of manuscripts. During the first 6 or 7 decades, the design of books transformed dramatically and on all levels. Gradually, the paper used became thinner and lost some 37% in weight between 1470 and 1550. Fonts multiplied in size and variance. In Latin books, Roman type replaced black letter in a period of about 4 decades. The average type size for text diminished and margins gradually became smaller, and as a result, more characters fit on a line and more lines fit on a page. A great deal of the space gained was reinvested as white space, white that had become to replace color. In addition to white lines and indents, ornamental initials, pilcrows and fleurons now appeared in print. Together with white, they helped navigate through text. And what is called visual typography, playful ways of laying out colophons, end sections, chapter titles, and finally also title pages, became the hallmark of Renaissance book design. You say Renaissance here or Renaissance? Both, okay, great. Around the middle of the 16th century, octavo and quarto had become the most frequent formats, and even smaller, even more portable and more affordable formats appeared on the market. So, good example of visual typography, typical for hallmark of Renaissance books in the middle of the 16th century. So you see untitled pages, you see at the end of text sections, and you see also there in the middle to lay out a title. In the second half of the 16th century, text showed more structure on lower levels. Pagination substituted foliation. Indentation of paragraph marks became the norm. Robert Etienne introduced verse numbering in Bibles, which was immediately copied in the southern Netherlands and elsewhere, and new numbering systems were added to text editions of, for instance, classical texts. Since antiquity, the first line or lines were rendered in a larger size than the subsequent lines. So, and this can still be seen in Roman epigraphy. If you go to Rome, to the Porta of Trajanus, for instance, you can see it in medieval manuscripts and in books printed up to the 3rd quarter of the 16th century. And afterwards, this phenomenon disappeared. Typical Renaissance phenomena, such as visual typography, gave slowly way, and the fashionable single vine leaf created in 1505 disappeared almost completely by the beginning of the 17th century. They are gradually replaced by Baroque head and tail pieces, and there you have one, an early one. During the lifetime of René Descartes and the following decades, more small books formats were put on the market, duodecimo now being the most important one. And finally, type for text in books in the vernacular, in Dutch, slowly but surely changed from black letter to Roman type, a process that took about a century and was first prepared on title pages from the 1540s onwards. The tipping point is around 1660, and that was also the period when differences in title page design between Latin books and vernacular books disappeared. So it's a case study. I started to look at vernacular title pages in the beginning of the 15th century. And what you see is that title pages in that period have a layout that is fundamentally different from that from Latin books. And slowly but surely, both design paradigms change over time under the influence of styles and so on. Well, I'll talk about that. And by 1660, the two have become one paradigm. And that was something that had never been seen before. Even less conspicuous, those transitions coincide with the abandoning of the old concepts to lay out titles, and that happened on two levels. First of all, the epigraphic letter V, standing for U in titles, fell into disuse around the same period. And at the same time, the phenomenon of typographical discontinuity totally disappeared to never really return in that form. So this is how typographical discontinuity dwindles down. For the rest of the Ancien regime, up to 1800, the organization of typographical page remained fairly unchanged. So on the left here you have a typical Baroque title page without illustrations here. And in the second half of the 18th century, new ornaments are introduced. Okay, skip this one. New ornaments are introduced along newly created special fonts. On title pages, printers used a new mix of different type families and all sorts of lines, double, triple, and ornamental lines and braces to distinguish titles from imprints. In this period, books adopted what one could label as a neoclassicist style. And I say, if I use the labels, Baroque, neoclassicist, Renaissance, you always have to, qualify it a bit. You cannot use them as such, but it's an easy way of talking about a period. On a deeper level, however, things remained fairly stable. Now I'm going to talk about the mechanism of typographical change, and this is probably the part where you will need a stiff drink. And there are fewer slides too. So the first part was, what's going on here, and now we're moving into the theoretical part. Over the course of a past decade, my interest shifted from the focus on mapping change to understanding change. And the question, how does this actually work, became more and more pressing. When I discovered the existence of two different typographical paradigms for Latin books on the one hand and Dutch language books on the other, and when I analyzed the appearance and disappearance of typographical discontinuity, I knew I was onto something important. But it was only until recently when someone urged me to read Bruno Latour's We Have Never Been Modern and other texts by him, and by, amongst others, Stephen Toulmin, that everything clicked. I came to understand that my approach of typography as a big prosciutto di Parma that had been, but that's really how I looked at it. So I had been slicing it up, in very thin slices, in flimsy fettuccine, And this was only productive up to a certain point. And now I had to bring all of it together again in order to better understand the individual slices, the ham as a whole, the producers of that ham, and the whole context within which that ham could come about. So that's Latour, okay? The objects and the subjects, bringing them together. And I work in Italy, by the way, so. Furthermore, the theory I will present now profited greatly from Kate Diston's outstanding book on cultural evolution, which was published with Cambridge University in 2010 or 11. This is the pocket softcover edition 11. Typography can be, according to Diston, and I, in fact, almost everything she writes about cultural evolution applies to typography. Typography can be considered as an artifactual language that packages content, in itself also language. Typography indeed bears the properties of language with the grammar, there are rules, and with the vocabulary, a stock of typographical features which can be combined. Experiments prove that typographical language can easily be picked up. I did this test 6 years ago. I showed you 4 title pages without a date and asked the public to put them in the right order, right? And although there were people here who had never seen an early modern book. So it is something that is not very complicated. The grammar is fairly simple, the vocabulary too, and you can easily pick it up. It has an intuitive structure and a compositional nature. Diston explains this as follows, quote, "The meaning of a portion of compositional language is derived from the meanings of its constituent parts and the way in which they are put together," end quote. For example, if in a given period proper names are printed in small caps and citations in italics, then this function remains also valid outside the main text, for instance in the paratext, such as printed marginalia, footnotes, or titles, where both elements can be combined. Contemporary instruction manuals for printers pay very little attention to typographical aspects, because the whys and wherefores were handed down in the printing shop from master to journeyman, just like happened in guilds and crafts. Within one geographical region, novices as well as newcomers impeccably applied the existing rules without effort. In other words, a printer in the mid-16th century had no difficulty to arrange text according to the actual paradigm. In other words, he had not to pass through every past phase of printing practice as it had been developed by Gutenberg onwards. Kate Diston demonstrates that, quote, "the human species is pre-adapted, or in other words, biologically prepared for culture, and in particular our tendencies to live in large social groups, to share information with one another, and to notice and imitate social conventions are all key factors in cultural evolution," end quote. This is a property which gives us an evolutionary advantage. I'm not a native speaker. Experiments shows that our species is able excellently to detect variation in information and that it can react to that variation. To quote Diston again in this, "Children imitate culturally arbitrary elements of behavior as well as means and actions." So when we grow up, we imitate not only what is rational, what has a direct purpose, but we also look at the way it is done. And the way it is done is also important, although there is not really a rational reason to do things this way or the other way. That is what she called the culturally arbitrary elements or culturally arbitrary behavior. And children spent the first years of their lives doing little other than absorbing linguistic and cultural norms of the society into which they were born, unquote. No wonder that printers new to the trade quickly understood to handle different layouts to books in different languages and about different subjects. In general, typographers did not feel the need to challenge the unwritten rules, because adaptation brings social as well as economic benefit. Moreover, native typographical language is felt as a badge of group identity, and typographical practices obviously worked as markers for social groups. And this is why typography remained so coherent within those social groups. So I only discovered this like 2 years ago. I mean that there is sociology and that there is a theory about that. But I've always had the feeling that in the southern Netherlands, the typography is extremely coherent, and that it differs from other language groups. And this explains me why. These considerations also shed light on many other questions related to typography, amongst which an important one asked in 2012 by David McKittrick in an article, "How can we tell if people notice changes in book design?" Well, sorry David, he's a friend, but I never actually understood this. The answer is that human beings are first and foremost biologically prepared to notice variations in information. Proof can be found in nearly all typographical changes, however subtle. In their own professional context, successive typographers noticed changes in new editions, rejected them, or applied them. And this even pertains to almost invisible changes in the dimensions of book blocks, shrinking margins, and changes in paper thickness. There simply is no other explanation for what happened. There was a variety of typographical practices which to a great extent coincided with regions where different natural languages were used: Dutch, English, German, French, Italian. And this is explained by the fact that languages, including typographical meta-languages, function as labels or markers for their users, which identify societies in which it is safe to collaborate. There is a benefit to stick to local or regional language, typographical language, and to maintain its custom and practices, even when specific elements in the course of history have lost their meaning. And this offers an explanation for the persistence of some of very old typographical practices, relics from antiquity or the Middle Ages, of which the original functions have sunk into oblivion. Those features did no longer have practical, instrumental functions and are to be considered as mere cultural and arbitrary behavior. Okay, so what strikes me as a curator immediately, English books, very ugly, but other than that, the boxes everywhere, the horizontal lines all over the place, French typography as opposed to Italian typography, little subtle thing here, but this fleur on there appears in lots of Italian imprints. So it's something, typical Italian. And then of course, you have the fraktura and the black letter for the German. I mean, and so it's not a coincidence that this is this goes along language borders. Okay, well, almost done. Understanding why. Now I will expand a little bit more about the question why typography constantly changed as it did. But let me first sum up some observations. So I showed some graphs, but not, I have like hundreds of them for each phenomenon that changes for each fettuccino of the prosciutto di Parma. So some overall characteristics. Typographical change can be characterized as progressive. Black letter is very slowly replaced by Roman type. And I showed many more graphs last time about that evolution. It takes 40 years to complete the transition for Latin books and about 100 for books in the vernacular. But when this process came to a close, there was no way back. On a statistical level, the transition is smooth, but in reality, this translates in a case-by-case decision taken by typographers. So you can have a trend, but at the end of the day, the typographer has to make the decision, right? Shall I maintain black letter for this edition, or shall I turn to Roman type? So it's a 1 or 0 decision, but statistically it progresses. Typographical change is also incremental. Text blocks increase and margins decrease, but at very slow paces. Differences can be measured, but become only evident after generations. Typographical change is constantly in flux. Not a single element transforms, but a collection of elements change simultaneously at different paces and at different times. The use of labels to indicate styles is convenient but also tricky because they suggest homogeneity, or you could also say they suggest a taxonomy. In reality, there are only very few pure Renaissance books, or books that are books with only Renaissance features. And the same goes for Baroque and Neoclassicist books. Most books bear the features of the prevailing period, but may also show relics of an older style, as well as features which will become dominant or fashionable in the future. So it's a mixed bag all the time. Typography is, in other words, constantly changing. Every single book project is the result of an on-the-spot assessment of the situation by the typographer. He, it is seldom a she, selects format, paper, types and ornaments and decides on the mise-en-page and the mise-en-texte, that is, the way that the information has to be arranged on the page. These choices are driven by targeted audiences on the one hand, and the status, reputation and functional features of the object on the other. Progressive, incremental, constantly in flux, those characteristics have to be borne in mind. In addition, 4 important forces can be identified that drive typographical change: technical and mechanical innovation, culture and fashion, characteristics and features of different text genres which are linked to specific use and functions of books, and economy. Depending on the context, several factors play at the same time and may reinforce or curb each other. The economic factor is present on many levels. Between the introduction of printed books in the southern Netherlands and the middle of the 16th century, enormous savings were made on raw materials by discrete reductions of the paper thickness, and examples can be multiplied. Cultural motives drive the introduction of new type families, Roman first, then italics, later, amongst others, civilité. Human ideals fueled the transition from black letter to Roman type, and it was first and fairly quickly completed for Latin books, while the process took much more time for vernacular books, indicating that pressures for renewal are much higher on the international markets and in the intellectual milieus. Civilité was created for cultural reasons as well. It was conceived of as a cursive variant of black letter, but its creation and use involved high costs, both in monetary as practical terms, and that it was hardly ever used for text, and that is why it was hardly ever used for text, and that its use dwindled down soon. The most conspicuous material and aesthetic inventions can directly be linked to fashions, the introduction of vine leaves, or fantasy types, or all kinds of double and triple lines. Some of those trends only lasted for a couple of decades and were in turn followed by new stylistic changes. On micro levels, printers and publishers stylistically updated re-editions of the same text with the latest novelties, convincing the public of its crispy freshness. The text genres typographically on the fore are related with the arts. Works of literature, poetry and drama, as well as architectural books, are the first to embrace new trends. Religious text genres, theology, liturgy, prayer books, catechisms, are in general much more conservative. Catechisms, chapbooks, songbooks for wide audiences and almanacs cling to tradition. Old-fashioned layouts have to signal orthodoxy and reliability. So it's not always clear to what extent the different factors here are involved, reinforce each other, or on the contrary, curb evolution. Take, for instance, the transition from black letter to Roman type in Dutch language books. Inventars from the Antwerp Verdussen company, about which Stijn van Rossum has talked here at one lecture. So these inventars indicate that the replacement by black letter of black letter by white letter happens in stages. On the one hand, it is clear that for most printers around 1660, that most of them decided to abandon black letter. Apparently, the public was ready for this, and the Verdussen company risked to lose clientele if it did not follow suit. But on the other hand, replacing dozens of cases of type at once did not make sense either. So they did it in stages, and black letter was only phased out when it was worn out and needed replacement anyway. Those considerations can slow down the process considerably. Case studies confirm that printers usually stayed on the safe side, and as a result, examples of over-enthusiast innovators remain rare. But there is an overarching factor, because how do you bring this all together now? Okay? During the long and apparently uninterestingly rippling so-called Baroque period, a number of apparently innocent and until recently unknown transitions took place in the 17th century. Economic nor technical motives were involved, because the changes in point did not require new material, but only a new way of arranging typographical materials at hand. They are not obvious, unlike stylistic features marking the Renaissance or Neoclassicist book. A first striking phenomenon is that the first line in titles dropped systematically to a lower position on those title pages. The typographical discontinuity began to dwindle. And third is the epigraphic letter V replacing the U in titles. It was abandoned, as I told you. All three changes have in common that they break with traditions which had prevailed for more than a millennium on buildings and in manuscripts. Former principles which had set the arrangement of titles and incipits gave way to a new model, a new approach, a new vision. This model crystallized around the middle of the 17th century and was governed by rationality and clarity. And from this moment onwards, meaning came first, form later. The new paradigm in representation of information is the pinnacle of a long process that has its roots in the 16th century, the century of discovery, travels, and many inventions. From the 1520s and 30s onwards, the use of white to indent paragraphs and to set titles and text apart helped accommodate navigation in books. In Bibles, first numbering was added by scholars from 50-55 onwards, and around this period, longer sections of text were more often broken up into smaller units, helping to refer to smaller information units more. The analytical approach of text, in turn, facilitated and stimulated scientific debate and promoted more detailed discussions amongst users. So at the basis of those fundamental changes are societal needs, to which authors, printers, and readers respond by reviewing the ways text in books should be laid out. Book design was continuously revised such that it better corresponded to the needs of users, who in turn refined those new layouts and stimulated the production of even better tools. Society recreated and reformed the book as an ever better instrument serving the needs of that society, and in turn, books that better corresponded to new societal needs endorsed and catalyzed this evolution. I'll conclude now. Typographical evolution has, just like cultural evolution, is biologically grounded. It functions like artifactual languages, has representative properties, and it is thanks to its compositional structure and easy-to-learn vehicle to wrap up language, facilitating transfer of knowledge. Like other cultural phenomena, typographical variation can be either rational instrumental, or culturally arbitrary. Typographical traditions within linguistic areas are fairly consistent and contribute to identity of communities. Like other languages, they serve as labels or markers which explains people's attachment to typographical models. We saw that typographical change can be induced by several different factors which may reinforce or curb each other. But however important tradition, economy, innovation, language, or genres may be, at the end of the day, it is social norms and societal needs which beliefs which cause fundamental changes in book design. After all, a book is an instrument in the hands of the community and has to serve that community as good as possible. This continually requires adjustments, both on micro and macro levels. The most important changes in design are not caused by fashion or style, but the result of much more fundamental needs. Thank you very much.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have time for questions, if there are questions. Yes, sir.
One thing I'm curious about, you say 1660 seems to be the turning point, so I'm wondering, like, what percentage of the population could read at that time versus other times? I wonder how that would drive the need for books.
It's an interesting question. Thank you. Literacy is, perhaps is an impossible question to answer. What you see, first, you saw the map of the southern Netherlands. You have like a town every 20 kilometers from each other, and in each town there would be competition for schools, Jesuits, Augustinians, and so on. So in the southern Netherlands there was a high level of literacy, but from the Middle Ages onwards, actually, from the late Middle Ages onwards, always been. But set that aside, I also study the economics of the book, and what really happens around 1550, mid-16th century, is that you see all the signals of market saturation, meaning that in the first 100 years of book production, printers are now really catering out loads of books and enough books. So the market in mid-17th century is a stable market. It is an established market, and bringing to that market ever smaller pockets and all that does not only show that perhaps they're looking for an even wider audience, but also that there is a need for product differentiation. And if you have product differentiation, it means that there are enough products. So, yeah. Is that yeah, so
Well, I think it brings some understanding of what was driving the changes.
I talked about this with sociologists, and when I showed the data, they would ask me like questions like, is there a political change? No, there isn't. Is there, well, in fact, you cannot put your finger on what's going on. But don't focus too much on 1650 or 1660. This builds up. But it's in the mid-17th century when we've got rid of all the formalities from the Middle Ages, and where the content and retrieval of text, a more rational approach of text, comes to an end. And then this book is now a new book. And so what happens in the 18th century is just stylistic and no longer fundamental.
Okay, thank you. Other questions?
One of the early developments which you mentioned was the shift from foliation to pagination.
Yeah.
I understand that you to say that was established by 1550?
It starts around 1540, 1550, and by the end of the 16th century, pagination is the norm.
That seems late to me. I mean, compared to other regions on the continent, but I can't quote you chapter and
It
verse
depends
on
a bit on the kind of books you're looking at. If you look at scholarly books, there's a higher need to be more precise.
that. Okay.
So I have statistics on this. So, you know, it really doesn't matter if I'm now here without my data 10 years off. I mean, it's second half 16th century. So we come from books that are not foliated, not paginated. So if readers feel the need, they do it themselves. And in the beginning, they do foliation, right?
Yeah.
And then it moves to, and then you could even go further, because there are also books in the 17th century that do numbering of columns.
Yes.
But the most important thing is that even editions of the Imitatio Christi, for instance, in 1591, they start to, or is it 1601, they start to add numbers to very small units of the text, because it's an important text, and scholars need to discuss specific parts of that text. So, yeah.
Question? Yes, Andrew.
First off, thank you. This was really quite interesting. And I'm really taken with how you are doing such thorough analysis of numbers, of things you can measure and poke and prod and plunk into a field. And then trying to link it back to, you know, decisions, as you say, that were happening while the data indicates a sort of smooth transition to a certain level, or a steady building transition. But it was day after day, typographers and print shops, you know, making decisions based on what they were trained and what challenges they were facing, or what all these socioeconomic and style issues. So this is, I think, a really interesting problem to be talking about. What's I think interesting to me is that there is not, through this period, major technological change in terms of printing materials or printing techniques. And yet there is this fundamental shift in terms of how their individual typographers in those shops are handling plans. And our tendency, I think, in graphic design has always been to line it up with changes in style and culture only. That, well, you know, compared to Baroque architecture, compared to the neoclassical, you know, music, or to, you know, all these other things that are going on. And there's enough truth in that that has, I think, distracted us from these other possibilities. And what you're essentially talking about is that by the beginning of the 19th century, we have, to some extent, rationalized the manuscript page out of design, and that we have only kept aspects of design that allow us to navigate in the modern eye to navigate, and that took hundreds of years as individual compositors shifted. Have I kind of understood
Absolutely. That is, that is the message I wanted to bring across. And
We have a translator.
yeah, thank you. We could have been done in 3 minutes. No, but so I'll be honest about this. In secondary literature, you can only find, the outliers, case studies about outliers, and then, the easy labels. It's books turn neoclassicist. Okay, perhaps true. Perhaps, I just published an article, 50 pages with like 40 graphs on the transition of title pages in the 18th century. And you see, in the middle of that century, there is a stylistic shift. And I've been always after, I was thinking like art historians, when is one fashion or one, movement followed by another one? Until the day, and it was this U and V thing, and it was this typographical discontinuity thing, and a new arrangement of titles on the title page. And then it struck to me that we go from a more organic organization of texts for the elite to a rational organization of a text for the society, for the at large. And this is in the middle of this Baroque period, which goes from the beginning of the 17th century up to 1750. 150 years, nothing. Well, on the contrary, it's then that it happens. But it's never been analyzed. And it's I'm making fun of my own statistics and all that and the fettuccine, but it's in the end, it's those graphs that showed me something is going on here, that I could not link back to a stylistic thing. If you look back to history, it takes centuries to get things done. Things speed up a little bit more now. But there are stories from 1950 where farmers would go to pray with eggs, to pray to a saint to heal the cows, Although we've had enlightenment by then for 150 years. So it's really tradition, it's really slow.
Unless there's disruption, of course, and that, as we've seen with the shift to digital, we saw change happen very quickly because there was massive disruption in the tools and in the economics and all of these things. And I think what interests me most about what you've studied here is that it's a non-event at a certain level. That it is like, this is a water's wet kind of argument because it just sort of happens over time. And to take, I'm impressed that you were able, by looking at those numbers and seeing that there actually was more than just this minor thing that you happen to kind of perceive and describe as style, that something more fundamental is happening, but it's happening like a geographic, or rather geological change, I should say. It takes a long time. It moves so slow that you don't see it.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is, as Andrew said, very interesting. Knowing that you've been studying the book, but do you know, is there a parallel with propaganda, like pamphlets and news sheets? Because there was a lot of, and you said it's not political, but there was a lot of turmoil and revolution during this period. So do you find that there's...
But already in the 16th century, this is the worst century. Up to mid-17th, the treaties of Munster and all that. And so it's really in this quiet period. I did some case studies about newspapers and all that, but to have them in big numbers, it's only in the 18th century that you can look at them. So you see changes, not important ones, like these changes. It's a pity in a way because newspapers are dated,
Well,
and you can.
Sorry, no, I was going to say also, but just the sort of sheets that would be sort of hammered up in the central square to to convey
I
information.
included some of those as well, and so you see the same phenomena, the broadsheets, and you see the same phenomena. They're not different. There are differences in language. There are differences in genre, and some genres are a bit behind, and some are on the fore, like the arts. I think this is not a coincidence. It's always the artists who are more creative and thinking of, new ways of doing things. And so, yeah,
Really interesting talk, and
Thank you.
made me think about what was happening in England and the changes there. There's two things. One is there's a huge market in international books in England, which would obviously have a big effect on the way books were expected to look like. And also, there are quite a few printers in England who came from the continent. And so I was wondering what that means in terms of regionalization.
Yeah. So what you see is when a compositor, for instance, moves countries, that he will apply not his original ways of compositing, but he will comply with the actual culture. There are also technical reasons to do so. So it's very difficult to see that through design, and case studies here are necessary. Now, I try to refrain from case studies as much as possible. I wanted to get the big picture first, and now I can look at specific cases. The international market is really interesting. All that you see change is always first in Latin books, highbrow customers. The competition is an international competition. You're not playing at home. You're playing in Frankfurt, and you're catering out your books to Italy, Spain, France, and so on. And they are copying what you do because they want to be, new, look fresh, have this single vine leaf on it. And so for a long period of time, you have two design paradigms. You have the local one in Dutch, and you have the Latin one. Now, this took me about 10 years. I think I could do England in 2 years. And then Italy, and then... No, the hypothesis would be that you have two paradigms in England as well, up to a certain point.
Yeah, I would agree.
Up to a certain point where both ways of designing books coincide. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know when. I worked at the Folger 2 years, but I was not paying attention to English books.
Yeah, I think that like a test case would be someone like Vitrolier. It's a printer in 1570s, 1580s, and he is pure continent. Continental typefaces imported from the continent, continental style, and but publishing English books. And then you might have someone down the road who's still using black letter for the same kind of material. And so you begin to get this kind of conflict or whatever, and the Roman wins in the end.
Yeah.
By the early 17th
Yeah,
century.
it's always the so-called higher culture, the more,
Yeah.
that is considered by the community as being the higher culture that influences. Yeah.
Joyce.
I'm really appreciating the sheer volume of work put into this. And I'm wondering, I'm wondering two things. With data curation on my mind, I'm wondering, will you be sharing your database in a repository at some point for other people to do? And will it, I'm thinking that what you've created is an excellent model for other people to do more of this kind of work. And have you found anyone doing this?
No, I tried very hard. In 2009, I got a postdoc to do this. So in my application, there was the database that should be open source. So I shared it with Amsterdam University.
Right.
I did some workshops with them, and then they left me. I think because of the sheer 3,000 fields there to fill out, you know. I myself abandoned that database after 4 or 5 years because I needed to speed up things. So I did, for instance, only title pages where you can suffice with 200 fields and you can, you know. So the sharing was there. So I made an how do you call that, a runtime version for which you don't need the software. So I'm still happy to do that. But what I do is when I have a big portion is ready, I publish it as an article. I have some 8 or 9 articles out there about aspects I talked about.
I'm thinking over the course of 10 years, that just the transitions in available technologies have been tremendous, those particular 10 years that you've been working. And, you know, maybe a database being produced today on the same principles might not be as cumbersome. I love detail, and I love the ability to bring detail together, because I think you're right that there are patterns you cannot see until you build the big picture.
Yeah.
That is a problem.
I tried very hard. I submitted about 5 projects to scale this up to a European scale. I don't know, it was depressing. And also, 2 of the proposals included, because this is perfectly possible, I checked this with people who know about this, do an automatic scan. You just feed the title pages or the text pages to an engine, a software, and it will do what I do by hand. And
exactly.
Yeah, but cost is about, I want to say, $250,000. And I got a review one day and it said, why would we spend that money on that? Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
I think that's changing.
I don't know. Yeah.
I would say that this happens in other fields too.
Yeah.
I'm aware of in science fields where long-term or longitudinal data, people say, why are we continuing to pay for this? What's the benefit? And not recognizing that sometimes you do need longitudinal data in order to be able to understand what really is happening. And you can't just take snapshots and find that, oh, that's what happened in our fish quality or whatever. You need to see trends over time. But supporting something like that over time is costly.
Honestly, I think the field doesn't understand what I'm doing. I have no peers in this.
You're a pioneer, so pioneers are often.
Yeah. Okay. Sometimes.
Are there other questions? Yes, Patricia.
If I can ask a second question.
Sure, you may.
I enjoyed your talk very much. You've prompted lots of questions. I'm reflecting back on some classroom sessions I've had with undergraduate students who've been asking questions about the books I've shown them. Can I ask you to say a little bit more about the thickness of paper?
Yeah. It's 1.5 years ago, it struck me that at that period I was preparing an exhibit on incunables, and it struck me that you could read everywhere in all handbooks, incunables are printed on thick paper, right? Okay, sure. When does it go away? So I started measuring in a systematic way. At first I took some 700, I measured some 700 books. And then I went up to 1540. Can bring back the graph if you wish. And then I got intrigued what happens after 1540. So what you see is actually a drop by 37%. What you also see is that you cannot see it in the books. You cannot see it. You cannot feel it, because a book from 1490 is only a little bit thinner than one from 1480. And that's a little bit thinner than one from 1470 on average. So you can only trace this if you measure hundreds of books. Okay? So it dropped by 37% by the 16th century. And what happens then is that you have a thickness of 10 leaves, 1 millimeter on average. Can be a bit thinner, up to 0.6, 0.7 millimeter. It's really thin. What happens then is that it becomes more difficult to print. The paper is so thin that sometimes you see the back shining, bleeding through. So it's becoming unpractical. It's missing its purpose at that point. And then it increases, from there on it increases. So they've reached the bottom. The market of books is saturated. So now you can play with them. And what you see is that the range of thickness shifts again. And from then onwards, printers are more often thinking again in case by case. They say, okay, I have this very small book, let's do that on thin paper. It's more because it's a thick book and we need to reduce the cover, the binding. And when I do a big folio, I can do it on nice paper, thick paper. People are going to pay a fortune anyway. And you also see variation, product differentiation within one title and all that. I'm actually preparing an article about that now, together with a German colleague, because I want to reach out to younger colleagues, and he's studying German incunables, and I want to see is what's happening in Flanders equaled in Germany. And so the first results are promising. It points in the same direction. This is a very smart way of reducing the cost of books, because you don't see it, you nearly don't feel it. It has a massive impact.
Could it also be?
I was just saying, I found this interesting too, but I only know basis weight and GSM, so I can't translate this into something that makes sense to me. Other folks here understand.
Tricia, back to you.
I just wondered if with the growth of printing and the very rapid expansion of book printing, that in fact materials were getting scarcer and that was an economy.
That's a way of dealing with it. That's also, so you see, it's not only, so it's always, you cannot go by one explanation only. One explanation for the very thick incunables is measure parchment. Measure parchment books, they have the same thickness. So it's a no-brainer. You want to put a new product on the market, don't scare the public away, so use similar materials. But then, so that's a cultural thing. And I think the cultural thing is curbing, the economics. Do not decrease paper thickness too quickly. Now you have to decrease it because more books are being printed. Paper stuff is limited. So if you can reduce it, you can have 3 sheets out of amount of stuff instead of 2 sheets. So there are all kinds of things involved here.
But wouldn't a sheet be the same price? I mean, you're doing it sheet by sheet. That's how people bought the paper. They weren't buying it by the thickness.
Paper makers,
Yeah, so the paper
Saving
makers
money.
would be.
making more money. Or
Yeah, the paper makers
Yeah.
might do it, but the.
Yeah, you're right. This is a
Yeah.
paper. We have to, of
So
course,
when
I know
back
it's the,
before
I know, but when Plantin,
Yeah.
okay, but when Plantin orders paper, he orders paper of different kinds. There is the variety is there. Paper has been here since the 13th century. So it's not a new product. You're not going to tell me that there wasn't thick or thin paper. It was all available. And you're probably right. Paper makers offering more thinner paper to the market, but then it's still a decision by the printer. What do I take? So, I should do manuscripts as well, and paper as well, and what else not? So you see, this is a fairly, it's a huge field. So.
And we will have to bring you back
Yeah.
So let's ask Jennifer Martin, Professor Jennifer Martin, to offer thanks.
So Dr. Proot has given us a beautiful example of a digital humanities approach to research by statistically comparing large volumes of data over time by, in your words, feeding the hungry beast of the database. We can see how the most minute changes in type can illustrate the larger picture. In my parallel life as a cartographer, I understand the importance of type design to cartographic image, how some designs attract attention, enhance legibility, or reinforce organization, but I never really understood how those things could come about. Dr. Proot has invited us to think of type design simultaneously through the long view of history and the close systematic view through a microscope, how societal needs affect type design and how type design affects changes in society, all culminating in a unique and inspiring theory of typographical evolution. That societal needs drive this has something very important, I think, to say about our current digital information needs in our digital age. And please join me in thanking Dr. Proot for introducing us to these fonts of knowledge.
Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I wasn't anticipating such a wonderful audience for this afternoon. Intriguing questions and the minutiae of data to entertain people on a Friday afternoon. It was a beautiful evening. Dr. Proot is still here. If you wish to ask more questions, please do come and ask him. I see some many students here in the room who might have questions for you. Please come and chat with Dr.